All right, YouTube, it's an auspicious time to be a pagan because the first actual pagan temple to be built since the era of the Vikings in Scandinavia is going to be built in Iceland. If I try to pronounce the name of the order that's actually constructing it, I'm actually going to fail. So I'll just say Asatru, because it's one group within Asatru's various assemblies. As far as I believe, they're called folk assemblies, or that might just be some of them. I may be wrong. I haven't studied that much about their specific beliefs, but I take it to understand that they're sort of like the pagan equivalent of the Christian Unitarians. In a way, they're more generally secular and accepting of outside belief systems and not really involved with some of the intolerance that goes on within other assemblies. But I'm happy about this because I've said to people now for years the pagan age is rising. I'm detailing this as a section within, again, I keep mentioning this, the book that I'm currently writing, which is now about 2/3 complete, actually. In only a few weeks, I've been writing like a motherfucker. There's an oscillating system within spirituality. There are other cycles and oscillations as well, but one of the major oscillations that happens is linked to the purification process that occurs under evolution. Because religions evolve the same as cultures do, the same as genetics. Life forms themselves evolve according to natural selection. I look at evolution on a biological basis, and I say that all life forms are essentially highly differentiated versions of the original life form that they came from. They're not competing with one another to exclusion, so much as they are purifying and improving one another because they come from that same lineage. They are essentially vying for different niches, different climates, different food sources, and they evolve over time, and they fill these resource bases largely due to chance alone and due to inner competition. They then improve themselves steadily over time. You have to have that competition, by the way, for life to exist for very long. If you don't, then these life forms tend not to change readily over time. They just get bottlenecked over and over by some physical process like a volcano or an asteroid, and it wipes the life back out. But if you have differentiation, if they diverge, then even if you have a cataclysmic event, that cataclysm won't equally affect all of those life forms. It's actually very good for life to continue existing if this competition goes on. I see the same at work within religion. You have two oscillating ages. During ages where things are very difficult, like the Dark Ages, when you've got collapse, you've got calamity, religions that tend to be more aggressive, they spread by fire and sword, they spread by severe physical competition, will take off and run with it, become stronger, and they will oppress the more intelligent, more pacifistic groups, like you see in paganism. When they do this, those pagan orders fall into two groups: those that die out and are forgotten, and those that persist specifically because they are purified, they are improved, they adapt more easily to those other physical conditions, literally physical oppression. And they're the more intelligent, the more forward-thinking orders persist, even under severe persecution. Then, when ages get easier, when there's less physical competition, people become less aggressive towards one another. They no longer feel the need. And in fact, states themselves, the actual political state, no longer tolerates physical oppression of minority groups. This is the age we're currently in and have been in for a little under a century, let's face it. The late Victorian era and the Edwardian era is really the birth of tolerance as we know it. That's really the era, the post-industrial movement, is really when we get the leisure time necessary to dedicate ourselves to more education of the masses, to more philosophical thinking, because you're no longer competing in the same way for physical resources. You've got enough physical resources, now you can focus on the mental plane. You can focus on improving the world around you, improving your beliefs, delving into philosophy, foreign languages and stuff. Until that period of time, most people were monolingual or outright illiterate. They were primarily concerned with getting enough to survive, and so for them, there was no time really to adopt these outside religious beliefs or really think about them. They didn't have the leisure necessary to do so. In the modern age, Paganism has begun to spread once again because these other religions that were so prevalent during that period of struggle are now seen as barbarous and backwards, specifically because the only reason they became relevant is that they were able to outcompete other religious forces by fire and sword. So in the modern, less physically aggressive era, those religious groups are seen as degenerate and are being replaced by groups capable of forward thinking. Christianity will persist, not in the form of religiously zealous, outright aggressive Christianity. It will continue to persist in the form of groups like the Episcopals and Unitarians. I think the Catholic Church, under their current Pope, is starting to embrace this philosophy. They realize that they need to think forwards. They need to think more philosophically and less in terms of enforcing their demands on their subjects as though they were some sort of kingdom, in order to continue to survive. Islam is doing the same thing. Social Islam has been expanding. Religiously zealous Islam is a dying force. I've pointed this out. What you see with these terrorists are the last gasps of these violent groups that wish to spread Islam by fire and sword. You don't see this problem in some of the Islamic countries in closer proximity to Europe. In fact, those that are geographically right across the ocean or right across the Bosphorus from the European mainland are not aggressive cultures. They're westernized cultures. They don't have time for this sort of Islamic hand-wringing. You see, in these cultures, you see factories and shopping malls and paved roads expanding and economies expanding and people learning and trying to get educated and get jobs and get married and go about with their lives. And they've got the time, they've got the leisure and wealth necessary to delve into philosophy and so forth. They are part of the first world. But if you go to the deep regions of Yemen, or if you go to East Africa or something, this is not the case. Those cultures have yet to come out of that period of struggle. But they are being outcompeted by the fact that these Western cultures now can delve into that education and philosophy to continuously improve their own technology, not just their spirituality, and it's no longer possible for those third world cultures to really compete. So in this modern era, we have gone back on the other side of the cycle to an era in which groups, religious groups that are less aggressive, less domineering, less involved with politics, and really more involved with thinking. They're more involved with intelligence. They're more involved with the embracing of modern technology. Those groups are the ones that are growing. Wicca has been growing. Paganism of all forms is growing. Secularity. And within secularity, not just atheism. People always talk about atheism and secularity as though they're the same thing. They're not. Within secularity, you have humanism and humanistic endeavors. You have certain New Age groups that are not outright religious. They're really more secular. You have various pagan groups as well, like these groups, that don't put a lot of stress on emulating or venerating these deities as though they're literal. They talk about them in a metaphoric sense. They talk about them in a symbolic sense. And let me explain. This is not inauthentic. The Greek philosophers and all of these pagan philosophers of antiquity thought the same thing. Many of these people did not regard those deities as being literally real. They began to frame them in terms of what they understood to be the natural world, the weather, the cosmic processes, and so forth. To psychology, early psychology, politics, culture, tribalism, all of these things fit in to this metaphoric system in which these deities, they fit fairly well, like pieces of a puzzle. They fit very easily to these human endeavors. And so a lot of these early philosophers began to understand these aren't real deities in the sense of Zeus is literally up in the clouds waiting to smite me with a lightning bolt. He's the father figure. He's the creative figure, the explanation for this sort of world around us that governs it according to the laws that are written about in these mythologies. These are archetypes. These are symbols and metaphors. That's the way that people have begun to understand the world. Now, there are definitely pagan groups that are very literal in their theism or their deistic in form. And that's fine. These groups will still remain more intelligent in the sense of they are not interested in spreading by fire and sword. In fact, they expunge the very notion of fighting over spirituality. And these groups, again, the older groups that were more zealous, that were more aggressive and more oppressive on a political and cultural level, have begun to die. We have oscillated back to that golden period in time in which it's no longer necessary for religions to do that. There's no longer the kind of competition for resources in most parts of the world that drives such a religion. Those religions only become relevant when there's so much struggle going on that a culture or a tribe may die out entirely if they're not willing to fight other cultures and try to get goods or tribute or something from them. In the modern age, we don't have that. And so when we regard these deep third world regions that still spawn Islamofascism or extreme Christianity like you see in parts of West Africa, or extreme anything else, when we see this, we look at them and we say, this is barbarous, this is a throwback to centuries ago. That is quite literally what it is. These cultures have lagged behind the rest of the world and will be displaced. The cultures themselves will modernize. These cultures will eventually embrace the concept of westernization. It's only a matter of time. The only thing holding them back is largely that they're being domineered by other groups that happen to have nuclear weapons, but are not part of that Western core yet. And this will change. And then eventually, in the future, this sort of what you could consider an age of intellect will also fall by the wayside. Another dark age will set in. Domineering groups will once again rise to prominence. In different forms. There will be different religions the next time around. This cycle takes thousands of years. There will be different religions the next time around. Just as the religions that dominated Rome at the height of the intelligence that existed there during that relative age of wealth and stability, relatively, not on an absolute scale, but it was relatively wealthy, things were relatively stable for several centuries, or any of these other empires. That age involved different religious forces from the current age. In that age, we have various Roman pagan deities. We have sort of the emperor cults. We have some of these Middle Eastern groups get imported into Rome. Some of the northern groups, like the Gallic religions, what we would call like Germanic religious forces, they get sort of incorporated. And there's tolerance generally until the era where Rome begins to falter and you have Christianity seep in. Until that period, Rome was one of the most tolerant cultures on earth. They had no problem with foreign deities. As long as they weren't outright inhospitable to their own beliefs, they adopted them as their own. They would borrow these gods from other groups. Rome falls, the Mediterranean basin becomes largely bereft of order, barbarians start fighting for 1,000 years, and Christianity spreads by fire and sword, and so does Islam several centuries later. These are now being displaced, and in the modern age, the new religious forces that have cropped up are a pure reaction to the sort of cultural things that we see around us right now. What is on the mind of Westerners from the current generation, which is the first one to fully experience this sort of Renaissance golden era of intelligence? Environmentalism, social order, is sort of the restructuring of society in a general sense, but nature as well, human nature. The use of psychotropics has come back into relevance post basically the mid to late 1960s. These things are all in modern discourse. So what are these religions that are cropping up? You have Wicca, you have various neo-pagan groups, secular groups that are spiritual, but they're not necessarily outright theistic. Humanism, groups like that. You have certain atheistic orders. I say orders in the literal sense, atheistic, what you would consider organizations that are involved in social activism, not necessarily veneration of some atheistic deity, which wouldn't even make sense. You also see a great deal of satire of religion. Look at the flying spaghetti monster or the invisible pink unicorn, and all of these things. These are technically simply satirical religious groups that exist to mock those same religious forces that for so long were prevalent and which now seem completely outdated. So I say we are living in a secular and pagan golden age. We're barely on the cusp of it. We don't know necessarily how long it will last. It could last 10 years or it could last 1,000 years. It's impossible to tell because all of these different cultural and religious and social cycles interplay on one another like a giant system made up of gears, and no two ages, even though they may be similar in form, will be exactly the same. The gods are different, the philosophies are different, the cultures are different, everything's different. You still have that overriding cycle affecting the world, but you can't necessarily make any solid predictions about what form it will take or how long it will last. Ultimately, though, I think it will generally be a pleasant time to be alive. Especially And I can't remember the exact. I can't remember the specific anthropologist or sociologist that thought it up. They thought about a cycle that lasted roughly 4 generations, and each generation sort of experiences a different mode. There's sort of an era of struggle, then there's an awakening, then sort of a golden period, and then the period of waning and collapse, back into the next 4-part cycle. We're at the last end of that cycle now, and will be for another decade or so. When that ends, we will be in another cycle of awakening. So by the time I'm in my middle age, according to this social theory at least, if it holds true, we should be in an even more positive era than currently we are. Spiritually, we're already in that positive cycle. We're fast approaching the positive aspects of the social cycle, and the political cycle as well is moving away right now from progressivism for progressivism's sake only, and sort of that multicultural bend. It has in turn entered that period of struggle which comes before that next awakening, because I can apply that same 4-generation cycle to spirituality and say we're basically in the same thing right now. And the thing is, these Abrahamic outdated orders, the Jews, the Christians, and Muslims that for so long have primarily waged war on the world, are passing by the wayside. They are being replaced. It's only a matter of a decade or two before the Western world is majority secular. Christianity and Islam will no longer be dominant forces. Secularity will be, and paganism second to that, even though some of those pagans are secular also. It's a good time to be alive. People, I believe, if I had to make a prediction for the next few decades, I'd say social conservatism may come back, but it won't carry the essence of moralism with it. It will instead carry moral progressivism, but it will still be fiscally and socially conservative. It might be a weird chimera, but it's one that would be a lot less warmongering than the sort of orders that we have today ruling the world. It will be a lot more intelligent, a lot less focused on sin and sort of the world is degraded and all of these weird topics that people imagined for so long. It will be less aggressive, less oppressive, and ultimately it will be a time where people will begin to become more introspective, more interested in philosophy and logic and all of these things, and more interested in nature, not necessarily like talking about leftist parties and their ideas regarding environmentalism, but rather conservation of the world. We all recognize it wouldn't be a fun world to live in if there's no forests, there's no mountains, everything's just city as far as the eye can see with a bunch of highways interconnecting it. That sort of diesel punk style world, that might be good for some people. Some people might enjoy that. The rest of us kind of want a world that's healthy to live in. And if you look at some of these third world cultures, again, who are the cultures that are actually trying to tackle pollution and runoff and soil degradation? Not the third world. They don't care. They're exploiting their resources, trying to advance to the same level that we're at, because they have to do that before they can even begin to conserve these resources. It's necessary, thus, for the Western world to try to aid them in that struggle, so that they can attain that modernity. So yeah, I know that's way, way off the original topic, but it all has to do with this pagan era. And this first temple, I believe, will not be the last that is actually built. It'd be what might happen. If it weren't Iceland, Christians would probably protest outside of it. But in Iceland, they don't seem to have any social problems at all, and I don't really understand it. Maybe it's that tower, the Peace Tower that they erected in memory of John Lennon or something. Maybe that pacifies them, I don't know. But for some reason, there seems to be like no crime or no social vice at all in Iceland. It's actually very strange, considering you've got a small remote population living in such a dark, cold, unforgiving land, and yet they don't have any social problems. I want to visit Iceland someday, by the way. I hear the food's shitty mostly. That's okay. I'll eat anything. I'll eat anything. I'm hungry right now, so I can't help it. That's about all. Peace out.